Hello, Barrett. How's it going, man?
Hello, how you doing?
Yeah, great. Whereabouts are you in the world?
I'm actually I split my time between London and Bournemouth. I'm in Bournemouth at the moment, so
Bournemouth. Okay, so not so far from Plymouth then, where we recently had the spree killer.
I'm only vaguely aware of where Bournemouth is, so I'll have to take your word for it.
Yeah. All right. So how come you ended up incarcerated?
I guess the main reason was that in early 2011, a company called Palantir, which has become increasingly prominent in the decades since, was concerned about the number of things that my associates and I had discovered about some of their operations. Certainly, damn tail. Okay. Became increasingly concerned about the things that we'd already helped to reveal about things they were engaged in, primarily the targeting of activists and journalists on behalf of their partners in the DOJ and the Chamber of Commerce. And so a number of secret grand juries were convened by the DOJ quietly at that time. And from there on, they began surveilling myself and those close to me for about a year, then began carrying out search warrant raids, my apartments, my mother's house in Dallas. And what was on board was on course to indicting me on charges that they kept shifting. It took them a while to decide what they were going to charge me with, but the decision had been made, a year prior, before the first search warrant raid, that I would be charged with something. They just had to decide what it was going to be, and so ultimately I was arrested, and I was facing 105 years worth of charges, 17 different counts, 11 for copying and pasting a link to information taken from a company called Stratfor and pasting it in my internet relay chat server where my volunteer journalists and so forth and myself, where we worked to investigate these firms and the intelligence community and so forth. Anyway, so I was charged with a number of crimes that were pretty bizarre crimes to charge anyone with. A lot of those were dropped eventually, and I pled to accessory after the fact to a hack of a computer. It was a hack of the company Stratfor, which is an intelligence firm in Austin, Texas, that works with the DOJ and FBI and foreign governments. Also pleaded to interference with the search warrant and pled as well to threatening a federal agent, an FBI agent, who was threatening to charge my mother, which they did eventually. So the U.S., we're talking about activism, we talk about the U.S., we talk about whistleblowing and transparency. This is a sector of activism and journalism that is, over the last 10 years especially, has been very intensely trod upon by the U.S. in particular, and that has manifested a number of ways, some of which are well known, some of which aren't. The Assange saga. Laurie Love, who's a British citizen, he'll be here in a few minutes here at the house in Bournemouth. He's an associate of mine. He's the one that the U.S. has been trying to extradite for a number of years as well. People who are engaged in activism of a certain sort, people who are focused on exposing criminal misconduct by powerful institutions, the intelligence community, law enforcement, so forth. They come after us with an unusually, with unusual intensity, and that's kind of been the case with me for over this time, and that's continued to this very day.
So I salute you for exposing these people who are plotting crimes against journalists, activists, and labor unions. But what led you to make the decision to do that kind of work?
It was a gradual thing. I have been doing that kind of work, as a mainstream journalist, for years, for outlets like Vanity Fair, The Guardian here in the UK, Huffington Post, and so forth. And what I came to discover as I grew older was that none of this reporting I was doing really seemed to have much of an impact. It was helping me, as with all journalists, my own career was being advanced, but it was hard to look to point to anything that had been achieved for the public good. And so I was more and more interested by about 2010, 2011 in some of the things I had seen uh, that had been achieved by activists who were using the internet, using information, using the new opportunities available to all of us in order to not just discover and reveal wrongdoing, but to punish it. And so I became increasingly, intermeshed with the anonymous movement. By late 2010, when Anonymous was involved with the Tunisian revolution against the Ben Ali dictatorship, with a number of Tunisian nationals who were involved in the revolt on the ground, working out of our internet relay chat servers. I was brought in to help to get involved with Anonymous at that point. And that was what we were doing at the time in early 2011 when we discovered we were being spied upon by ex-US military intelligence figures like Aaron Barr, firms like Palantir and so forth. And so, my original reason for getting into this was to help people achieve democracy, overthrow dictatorships abroad. And we came to discover that was something that if you engage in it in ways that someone in the US government or the UK government deems to be contrary to the interests of those countries, you will be punished for it. You'll be pursued and pretty aggressively. And so that's when my interest shifted to the intelligence contracting sector, to the intelligence community as a whole. We had to start learning about it. We had to start, going further into these investigations, into the companies and the practices, the technologies that are now available to private firms that pay for them. The technologies and the methodologies that are available to discredit, to put out disinformation, to confuse the narrative, to make informed consent impossible. And those are the kind of the themes and the subjects that ever since I've been mostly focused on, because these things, these technologies, these techniques, they make everything else impossible. They make it impossible to engage in journalism. It makes it impossible to be a citizen. It makes it impossible for a public to know or to have some sliver of possibility of knowing what is being done in their name with their tax dollars. And so when information is tainted, when it is subverted by the highest bidder, as it has been increasingly, whatever one's issue is, whether it be climate change, civil rights, women's rights, anything, all of these things become secondary. They become the conditions are such that these issues will be decided not by the public, not by journalists, not by citizens, but by shadowy sort of alliances between private and public and power. And that's a dangerous situation that the more one learns about it, the more one experiences it, the more one comes to understand that this is a problem that has to be solved before any other problem can be solved. It is a fundamental problem facing us.
So would you describe yourself as an ex-anonymous member?
Well, anonymous is a strange kind of thing in so much as that it's a movement. It doesn't have a charter. It's not like the CIA or the Freemasons or Bank of America or Cub Scouts. It was never created, and so kind of drifted into existence gradually. So there are no members as such, but there are and have been individuals who were identified both inside the movement and among its enemies, law enforcement, so forth, as especially influential participants, and that's what I was. After some months of working very closely with Anonymous out of the AnonOps IRC server, it came to occur to me that this lack of structure and this lack of charter made it very difficult for someone like me to work effectively in this thing. It was especially vulnerable to infiltration, especially vulnerable to turning into something else. And indeed, Anonymous, since the time I worked with it, 2011, 2012, has really become vastly less significant than it was. But it's also taken on a different character ideologically. It's become more of an alt-right almost of a thing. And so that's one of the reasons why I started working less with Anonymous and more with people I had taken from Anonymous or from other groups and put into my own organization, Project PM. And that's how I work today. I have a number of sub projects and some signal groups that include journalists and so forth, people who were involved with Anonymous like myself, people who come out of other very, very different backgrounds, former members of parliament, journalists from mainstream outlets, and so forth. I want to make sure that I have a degree of control over the things I'm working on, because the alternative is that I might again end up acting in a way that can be subverted from the outside for ends that are very different from what I want. The Anonymous, for instance, was infiltrated pretty heavily. By the time I was put in prison in late 2012, by both the FBI and Russian intelligence. Sometimes sometimes in incidents in which they were sort of interfacing, or engaging in these very complicated and baroque ways. Anonymous was identified pretty early on, not just by me, but by the intelligence community of different countries, as a very significant dynamic that, in its own right, could be successfully subverted and used for different ends. The U.S. used it to go after Syria. The Russians used it in ways we don't quite understand fully yet, but and may never understand, but which did involve, trying to subvert the U.S. Back and forth and so forth. There's an interesting incident regarding that, involving a FBI agent who oversaw a Ukrainian-born Russian-speaking hacker who they were using as a cooperator, and who the Russians themselves were also probably using as a cooperator at the very same time. And that FBI agent later was indicted by the FBI, or prosecuted by the DOJ. His name is Hilbert, I believe. Anyway, so what I'm saying is that it's a very complicated way of doing activism, and it's very vulnerable to outside influences and its own internal failures. Anonymous, again, because it was so amorphous, because it was so agile, and so what we're trying to put together, using those lessons, is something that's more focused, that we can better ensure will maintain, certain goals over time, and will be less vulnerable to, being turned into just one more extension of the existing institutions.
How easy was it for you to click up with Anonymous and become a participant? Did you have to go through some screening process?
I wish that was the case. That would have been a fine addition to the recruiting. In my case, I was identified as someone of interest to them in early 2010 after I wrote an article for Huffington Post, in which I was sort of predicting that Anonymous, based on what it had already accomplished, versus the Church of Scientology, which your last guest was talking about, and versus the Australian government when it was trying to pass some new censorship legislation, I'd identified it as something that would become, in its own right to some extent, but also as an example, as a proof of concept, a massive new factor in geopolitics, and that I predicted that it would go on to overthrow nation states, and that did begin to happen, I guess, about 10 months after that. Anyway, they found it interesting. I was contacted by someone who'd been involved in turning Anonymous into effectively an activist group some years prior, and who still maintains some control over the movement. And so him and I spoke on and off over the next year. And then, as I mentioned earlier, at the end of 2010, when the Tunisian Revolution began, I was brought into the Anonops internet relay chat server to work with these Tunisians and others on that. And so from there, I very quickly became, I took on some various roles within Anonymous, sort of as their sort of chief media strategist, so on and so forth. And, I worked with them fairly closely on and off for the next year and a half or so. And then upon emerging from prison in 2016, by that time, Anonymous was no longer a factor, and it had kind of fallen victim to its own sort of internal contradictions, as you might put it. And, but nonetheless, the lessons one can learn from Anonymous in the main, which is that emergent groups of individuals working together without much structure can be vastly effective. The Taliban have proven that again this last few days. I don't know if how many of your viewers have seen these articles that have come out about their use of WhatsApp to secure the surrender of many Afghan national troops, a month prior to today, and to use to organize, the sort of early instances of their government mechanics. But these things, signal groups, WhatsApp groups, IRCs, they are vastly powerful weapons, and that's something that the U.S. Marines, for instance, have recognized since 2009. In these sort of internal reports where they identify, emergent actors, non-state actors, working in these kind of confines as one of the key threats to nation states in general.
What was the day of your arrest like?
It was odd. I was doing a video cast, a live video cast, as I often did with some of my volunteers and so forth. And then the SWAT team arrived. My
During a live video cast, the
Oh,
SWAT team arrived.
yeah.
Holy
And
shit,
and
man.
it was captured. Yeah, it was on YouTube the next day.
Wow.
Yes,
Is
you
it
can
still
hear
on
me.
YouTube?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, we got to get that clip up.
Oh yeah, no, it's interesting. But they break in. You can kind of hear them screaming Barrett Brown down the ground. You can kind of hear me screaming, so I'm getting beat up a little bit. And then it goes off at a certain point after that. But so I think about 30 seconds, I think, of the raid was captured by audio. And yeah, so it was odd because I mean the FBI agents who were there with the SWAT team that then took me to be booked. I knew who they were. I've been investigating them for some time. One of the reasons that these things keep happening is because I do actively and aggressively investigate law enforcement, intelligence community figures, and so there's a bizarre kind of back and forth kind of conflict that goes on perpetually where we know who they are, they know who they are. That's how it is. Just about a month ago, I was able to release recordings of FBI agents at a LA meeting, the LA headquarters in November, discussing me and discussing my network with an informant. So they get my stuff. I mean, they have to basically send people to come take my electronics really to best get the files I have. The way we get their files varies. It's generally a little bit more novel than that, but there is a back and forth kind of information conflict that goes on.
All right, so you get SWAT teamed, and then do you get taken to a county jail?
I got taken to the Dallas holding center just for that same night, and then brought to a federal center the next day since I was a federal target. And from there on, the next 2.5 years fighting my case, I was in federal facilities, and then 2 years after my sentencing, was in federal prisons, a low first and then a medium after I got kicked out of the low. And yeah, yeah, in the U.S., in particular the region I come from, Texas and the Southwest, you have a lot of federal inmates, and more than they can hold, and so they do put a lot of them into county institutions because again they just lack the room. So I did spend a good portion of that time, probably about 1.5 years altogether, of my pre-trial detainments in county facilities that were meant for to hold people for a couple of days, but were now being used to hold people for years and years.
What was breakfast like? Green bologna?
Sorry. No, I'm very fond of sandwiches, and I never had any problem with the sandwiches. I love sandwiches. So
how did the prisoners view you? Were you like a freedom fighter?
For the most part, yeah. By the time I gotten into the place I spent the most time at, about a year before my trial, the Rolling Stone article had already come out that a lot of them had read. Local papers had covered me really intensely. I mean, some of them were confused exactly what I was doing, who I was, and that's understandable because the coverage was very confusing and contradictory. But they were all aware that we had successfully exposed a lot of FBI misconduct, and so that makes you pretty popular in a federal holding facility.
Did you have any problems during your incarceration with guards or prisoners?
Well, I spent about 6 months of my 4 years in prison being placed in the hole, generally on investigations after I spoke to the press from prison about prison misconduct. So yes, and I was also involved in some inmate demonstrations against the guards, and I got involved in prison politics to some extent. It's my nature, and so ended up taking control of the white prison gang at the Seagoville facility where I was at for about a month, 2 months, and then got into a conflict with the neo-Nazis who were trying to take back control, and they went to the guard. And so the day after my first sentencing hearing, I've had 2 of them. I was shipped to another place because they kind of given up on. Again, I am very good at what I do, and so it does take, so you have to take dramatic measures sometimes to get rid of me. And so
you had a conflict with the Texas Aryan Brotherhood, by the sounds of it.
Yeah, Aryan Brotherhood of Texas. Yeah, it wasn't them as such. It was some members of the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, and then a member of the Dirty White Boys as well. He were the ones that I was most in a conflict with at this point. They were trying to take back control of the gang. We had taken over. I'd been elected leader of the whites there, and we renamed the whites to the Naughty Naughty Kittens, and done other things that they found offensive. And so, we kind of gave them no choice. And I was also writing a column from prison, starting about a year in. That's where I ended up winning most of my awards for, the Barrett Brown Review of Arts and Letters in Prison. And in that column, aside from other things, I went into, name the wardens, go into prison incidents, so forth. That obviously caused some difficulties for them. And so that might help to explain how many times I was transferred from prison to prison.
Donna
Also might explain why I was let out 6 months early.
Donna wants to know how the heat was in the Texas prison system.
So, and the state prison system in Texas has been notorious for that for a number of years. There was no air conditioning in any facilities. It's one of the things I used to report on, actually. The federal system, even though these places are in Texas, they're run by the federal branch, so there's very different policies and procedures and so forth. So we had, with the exception of the time I was in the SHU in Dallas, the Seagoville facility for the summer, where there's no air conditioning. With the session of that, there's no problem with it. But the state prison system has had a lot of lawsuits. There's been a lot of coverage of this on and off about deaths have been caused by the fact that you're holding people in concrete dungeons in the middle of a Texas summer. And I recall that that's being addressed to some extent in the last couple of years, but I can't remember where things are with that exactly.
Did you get along with all your cellmates?
No, not all of them. No. But for the most part, yes. For the most part, they were very interesting people. I mean, the thing about the federal system, the FBI and so forth, is that the people that they go after, whether they're guilty or not, they tend to be very interesting people. And so you stick them all together in a big, giant facility, you've got like almost a handpicked, I mean, it's amazing that more shows don't get produced. Frankly, it's a shame that so much interesting occurrences is just sort of lost to the rest of humanity, because we can't get cameras in there for the most part. So much goes on that's just fascinating. So yeah.
It was in the Arizona county jail that launched me as an activist, because I asked the guard, I said, how'd you guys get away with all this stuff? Dead rats in the food, cockroaches crawling all over us at night. And the guard said, the world has no idea what goes on in here, and the public doesn't give a shit about prisoners. So that set me on a path to exposing what was going on. But where I was housed, it was all racial gangs. Was it racially divided where you were at?
In a way, but it's bizarre. Places I was at, there were generally divided between the whites, the Tongos, Tongo Blast, which is a U.S. Hispanic gang, generally younger drug dealers, the Paisas, who are generally Mexican nationals or other South American, Latin American nationals, and then the blacks. But these groupings are, they're not necessarily in conflict. And in fact, in many cases, they're in cooperation. They're just divided, out of tradition into these groupings. And it does vary quite a bit from prison to prison and from system to system. And so there's some federal prisons where I would have been, automatically considered to be in allegiance with others from Texas, of whatever race or whatever gang, against like Oklahomans, for instance, hopefully, because Oklahoma is kind of we're not fond of them. But, in other places, it is by gang. Other cases, so religion comes into it in terms of, the Muslim groups and so forth. Sometimes region comes into it. Sometimes gang affiliation. You have white Crips here and there. You've got white Muslims. One of my cellmates in the SHU was a white Muslim who, at this facility was among the whites, was going to the white gang meetings. But, another facility, he'll be with the Muslims, almost none of them were white. And so it's very complicated. And it's, and it varies quite a bit from place to place. But I mean, there was not much conflict. There was actually less racial conflict in most of the places I was at than there was back in the U.S. when I got out, in November 2016. I've watched as young, like black drug dealers admire a white Aryan guy's swastika tattoo because of its fine stitching. I mean, it's a weird environment. And yeah.
I saw neo-Nazis convert to the Jewish diet so they could get the kosher food.
That's a good idea on airplanes and prisons. I mean, that's a universal,
There was Mexican mafia Jews, Italian mafia Jews, even Sammy the Bull's son converted. All right, so we've got just 4 minutes left. I'm just gonna put some questions from the viewers to you for this time. So, question here is from Momzilla. What would be the best way for people to get involved now that Anonymous has proven itself to be too vulnerable?
Yeah, so for the last 10 years, I've advocated breaking up into more delineated groups with more emphasis on information operations rather than hacking. Hacking it's as far as I'm concerned, it is no longer viable. It's dangerous. Hackers themselves tend to be unreliable. And the fact of the matter is we have so much information now from the leaks and the hacks for the last 10 years. The problem is not getting more information or proving wrongdoing. The problem is getting is convincing the press and citizens to act on that wrongdoing, and giving them ways in which that could be done. And so, so the groups I run, and my Twitter account, my Twitter account is Barrett B, BARETTB. Groups I run, just like Project PM, which has been around for 10 years, are mostly, we are geared towards collating, documenting, and presenting misconduct by the press, by law enforcement, by corporations, intelligence community, and so forth, and then ensuring that individual members of these entities, that they're feeling pressure publicly from the things that they get caught doing. And so, yeah, that if you take a look at my tweets and so forth, look at what we put out in our different groups, Project Schwartz, Project Hastings, Project PM, you'll get a sense of what it is we do, what we don't do, and why they're effective. I mean, you'll get a sense of why it is that the FBI, as we speak, and the Metropolitan Police and so forth, are still kind of coming at me in very unusual ways. And the answer is because we have found a formula that works. It's entirely legal, entirely justified, and quite frankly necessary. And that's what makes it all the more difficult for them to contend with. It's information operations. Yeah, and that's so. That's the broadest answer. That's the best answer I can give here. It's complicated, but that's what I would say.
Stephen Pugh wants to know if you're involved with the Lizard Squad.
No, I'm familiar. I'm familiar with them. I don't remember which one they were. There's a lot of these little subgroups and so forth. I tended to work mostly simply with the more prominent members of Anonymous, or participants in Anonymous, and then my own group as well, which was Project PM. Most of these other groups, it's hard to determine what they are really, who's involved, if they're actually activists, or if they're just trying to, if they're adventurers, quite contrarily. And so I tended to stay away from those kind of things, and still tend to do that.
Paulie Walnuts has asked if you're familiar with the Illuminati Project by Fascio 1212, now on systems.com.
I'm not familiar with that at all.
All right. So did you say you're in Bournemouth?
I am. My fiance's mother lives here.
How long are you in the UK for?
Well, I came here about 9 months ago, and now the Home Office has my passport. So I guess I'm here until they either successfully get me shipped back to the US, which they're trying to do, to face another round of sealed charges from the FBI, or until I'm able to establish asylum, and preventing them from doing that. But I'll be here until something gives, I guess. So it's hard to say.
Did you get out on the beach the other week when it was really sunny?
We did. I didn't mean to, but I did.
Well, look, I'm only an hour and 20 minutes up the road from you, and we've got a studio up here. So if you want
we live in London, actually. My girlfriend, we live on a canal boat in London. So if you're in London, yeah, so we can meet up.
If you want to do a longer interview in a studio, we could arrange that, because it's a fascinating story. So love to get into way more detail with you at some point, Barrett.
Absolutely. We'll be back in London after this weekend. So,
all right. So I'll let people. We've got your Twitter in the chat, and what is that your preferred method of people contacting you? Is Twitter or?
Yeah, it's one of the few I have left. The DOJ has got my Facebook page erased late last year.
Holy shit.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, man. I really appreciate you spending time with us, and I hope you get your passport back and things get back to normal for you.
Thank you very much. Well, this is normal, unfortunately. But
Take care, brother. Cheers.
Oh,
bye.